Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
Jacob was about to leave. He looked in the mirror once more, rated his appearance a solid B+, and looked at his watch. Calculating the distance from the house to the science library, he concluded that there was no need to hurry. He had about 20 minutes to spare, and he wanted to wait for his son. Thinking about John, Jacob sighed heavily. Who would have thought that he could envy the parents who complained about the laziness and amorphouseness of their own children? But he did. Sometimes he realized that it was stupid, but sometimes it happened. He himself got a child who was hardworking and independent. John did not want to use his father's connections, and having failed the entrance exams to the institute, went to work. And what a magical place he found, a vegetable base, just right for the son of a math professor. It was impossible to dissuade the stubborn one from this dirty work. After 3 months of working as a fetch patty, the boy decided that he needed more money and got a job as a janitor. Jacob watched his son, all with increasing horror. No one would argue, money was indeed needed. John was taking the preparatory courses he needed for admission. But why couldn't he just ask his father? Why was it necessary to exhaust himself at 2 demanding jobs? Jacob was secretly proud of his son, but he also feared for the boy's health. He wouldn't overwork himself. When John became a first-year student, his father breathed a sigh of relief. Now the boy will be busy with his studies and leave his exhausting part-time jobs. But the hell he didn't. John left the vegetable base, but remained in the janitor's, and in the evening worked as a watchman in some kindergarten nearby. "Come on, Dad." With a cheerful bewilderment, he asked every time Jacob organized a reprimand for the fact that his son does not spare himself. "In the garden is quiet, and the whole night is mine. I sit outlines read, and I'm paid for it." Is that bad? And then there was a tire repair shop, and smelling of gasoline and machine oil, John was home far past midnight, and in the morning ran to lectures. How did he manage to do so well? It's a mystery. But by graduation, the guy managed to save money to open his own, albeit small, store. "And what do you want to trade?" Jacob asked gloomily. He did not like the idea of the store. After all, the son of a prominent scientist, and suddenly an ordinary peddler. But John did not care about such reasoning. "Food, Dad," he answered cheerfully. "It's more correct, isn't it? All kinds of clothes, furniture, it depends on a lot of things. But people will always eat. I will start with vegetables and fruits, and then, if things go well, there will be meat and dairy in all kinds. If things go well," my father mocked, trying not to show his disappointment. He knew that John would do well, and that meant saying goodbye to his ambitious dreams of a dynasty of scientists. John was not attracted to that path. Maybe it was for the best. John returned home, tired as hell. He wanted more than anything to dive into the cold bathtub to cheer himself up. But the only strength he had left was to crawl to the couch and collapse on it, throwing his feet upright on the velour upholstered armrest. The father looked sternly at his collapsed son. "You could have at least undressed first," he said sternly. "Dirty as a dog, all over the sofa." "I'm sorry, Dad." With difficulty moving his lips, replied John. "The movers went on a bender, so I had to unload the goods myself. Potatoes, onions, heavy, damn, and I'll clean the sofa myself later." Jacob, without answering, left the living room and quickly returned with a wet towel in his hands. "Here," he threw the towel to his son. "At least wipe your face. Give you this idea of your own store. Now you'll have to work for the movers and shifters, and also at the cash register. By the way, Don't you mop the floors yourself?" I did. John pressed a towel to his forehead. "Twice washed, and if necessary, I'll help you." "Dad, give me a break." "Well, honestly, you were going somewhere, I think." "Me? Yes, indeed. Dad's in a hurry. I have to stop by the library. I can stay there for a while." "Uh-huh," the son said. The towel successfully hid his smile. "Sure, Dad. Break a leg." Maybe Jacob didn't get the hint, or maybe he just decided to ignore it. But he put on his shoes in silence, and only when he opened the door did he mutter under his breath, "To hell with it." Kathy was waiting for him, standing on the wide porch of the library. Jacob's heart throbbed, even though he knew he was attractive and had long ago been accustomed to female attention. The thought that this young, beautiful graduate student had fallen in love with him was as intoxicating as champagne. When she saw the familiar car, she smiled and slowly, holding back her impatience, approached. Jacob got out to open the door for the girl. Kathy was so touching in that scarlet beret of hers, with her black hair poking out from underneath. A Parisienne, he thought. That neat bob, the striped, calfskin-like sweater, the white jeans, the perfume with its not bright, but subtle scent, which he only smelled when he leaned toward the girl. "French chick, we'll just stop by the house, not for long," he warned. "I seem to have forgotten my wallet." The girl laughed. "Well, what can you do? All the great scientists were absent-minded." "Then I'm not great." Jacob thought, but of course he did not say it out loud. In fact, he had his wallet with him, and it was nicely tucked away in the inside pocket of his jacket. There was no objective reason to go home, but other than one, he wanted to see how John was doing. He was probably so exhausted that he'd fallen asleep on the couch as he was clothed. Although Jacob knew that his son had been an adult for a long time, he still couldn't get rid of the purely parental habit of worrying about him and keeping an eye on him. Now he was willing to sacrifice precious minutes with Kathy just to make sure John was okay. Jacob made sure John was asleep in his room. At least he could get undressed and washed up. Jacob thought and walked silently to the exit. He quietly shut the door behind him and headed for the elevator. At the same minute, John got out of bed and went to the window. There on the street, near his father's car, Kathy's graduate student was pacing back and forth. No, John had nothing against his father having an affair. After all, his dad, a successful and handsome man, wasn't even 60 yet. How could that not be the age for love? He'd built a career, raised a son. You can finally think about yourself. But when it came to Kathy, John squinted his eyes at his stepmother. Tall, slender, with appetizing forms, Kathy was good all around, and yet John didn't like her. Something in her was so cold, calculating, and perhaps even mercantile, there was some greed in her. That's what. Yeah, well, his father's a grown man and not stupid, so he'll figure it out for himself. John stretched and climbed back into bed. Tomorrow he had to work early again. He rolled over on his stomach, hugged his pillow, and in a minute he was fast asleep. 5 years passed. Kathy sobbed very naturally, to a swollen nose, to red eyes and shaking hands, with wailing and rhetorical questions about what she should do now and on whom her so young and beloved husband left her. Those gathered, and here were Jacob's colleagues and his friends and neighbors, amicably pitied and consoled the widow. She was still young. Almost audibly, they talked among themselves. At such an age to be widowed and have no children, and Jacob could still live. How could it be so? Only the day before yesterday I saw him, as always, cheerful, with lots of plans. Kathy was sitting on a chair, rubbing her handkerchief, which was wet through and through. Someone put valerian in a glass of water. Someone offered her vodka. She swallowed everything offered without looking, and John did not leave a vile feeling that he was present at some well-directed performance in which everyone had his own role, and the actors acted very coherently, everyone in his place, everyone gave each other lines and perfectly remembered the text. Sit down, everyone a $5. He thought and immediately ashamed of his thoughts. It's not good to think like that. It's not good. Kathy is also very much worried. He lost his father, and she lost her favorite person. Was she better off than he was? He forced himself to approach the young widow. Kathy looked up at him, grief-stricken and fear-stricken, with a blurred look. "John, I'm here." He put his hand on her shoulder. "Together we'll hold on, and then we'll get through the grief a little easier. You're not alone." The woman squeezed her eyes shut and shook her head painfully. Frequent tears ran down her bloodless face in streams. Don't cry." He was silent, not knowing what else to say. He had never been good at consoling. "Don't cry, calm down." What kind of nonsense is that? How can you calm down? If death, gone, a person forever, loved and close, the most dear. And why don't you cry? Who'd invented the idea that you can't cry? Bullshit. He patted Kathy on the shoulder. "I'm here for you, Kathy. You just have to get over it." She said something softly, and John had to bend down to make out the words. "It's my fault." "What?" He shifted his eyebrows, staring intently into her face. The hysteria? Or was it just that she didn't know what she was saying? Mad with grief. "Yeah, don't talk nonsense," he said sharply. "Dad had a massive heart attack. What's that got to do with you?" "Aya." Stammering, she whispered. "Jacob got sick. It was morning, about 11 o'clock. He said he had a chill on his left side, said his arm was numb." So, John didn't understand her. "How could you know what was wrong with him?" "You're not a doctor." She shook her head again. "He said he needed nitroglycerin. I went looking for it, but it was out. So I ran to the pharmacy, said I'd get some. Jacob was so pale, and when I came back, he wasn't breathing. There." She pointed to the couch. "He was lying there. It's my fault, John. I should have called an ambulance, shouldn't I? Come on, don't blame yourself, Kathy. You couldn't have known." "I should have known." The woman moaned. "I should have. It's my fault. It's my fault." She swayed from side to side. "I'll take some valerian," said John, looking for the vial with his eyes. Kathy clutched her hands into her hair, her hands, her narrow white, long, narrow fingers tangled in her black hair. "Guilty, guilty. Just a second, Kathy. Where's that valerian, damn it? My bad." Father's friends who had come to pay their respects had stopped whispering, and now they were all staring at the unhappy widow. "I'm to blame." Kathy cried out heartbreakingly and fell on her knees before John. "Forgive me, John." "Kathy." Someone shyly called out to her, but she paid no attention, did not even turn her head. "John, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Jacob." "Calm down, Kathy." The shocked John barely spoke. He bent down and picked her up under her elbows. "Calm down. It's not your fault. Come on, Kathy, have a drink." Some guy separated from the frozen mass of people, approached Kathy, and shoved a shot glass with some amber liquid under her nose. That's the way to do it. John's face seemed vaguely familiar, like he'd seen it somewhere before. Of course he had. It was at his father's wedding. The guy was invited from the bride's side. Either he was Kathy's brother, or he was a relative of some kind. The woman obediently took a drink and stood up, leaning on her kinsman's arm. "Come on, Kathy, let's sit down." The guy led her to the sofa, but Kathy stopped and shook her head silently. "Don't you want to go there?" "All right, let me put you in the chair." "That's it. Good boy." John silently walked over to the couch, stroked the upholstery fondly. The good old sofa. How his father used to scold John if he came home tired and fell on that carefully guarded work of art. When father was gone, Kathy called him first, and John came before the ambulance. Father seemed so majestic and calm. He was lying on the couch with his eyes closed and a slight smile playing on his lips. He seemed to be just sleeping. People surrounded Kathy and again began to whisper to her some correct, but alas, completely meaningless now, words about eternal rest and immortality of the soul. But the main thing was that they talked to her, did not let her stay alone with her grief. John went into his father's study. Everything was the same there, as if Dad had just stepped out of it, say, to have dinner. On Jacob's huge desk, some papers with the next calculations were piled up. The system unit was humming, meditative stuff, with which the stationery stores are full, flaunted on the shelves on the edge of the table. For some reason, my father was often given such junk as souvenirs. John touched the frame with the sand, turned it over, and the picture of some alien landscape began to change before his eyes. Multicolored sand was now falling from above, forming new patterns, reliefs below. The sand was a reddish-golden color. What red-colored planet is there? Mars? Yes, definitely Mars. So we can imagine we're on Mars, and all this Earth stuff is just a dream. John neatly stacked up my father's papers and weighed them in his hand. Weighty. Dad was always greedy for work, and John called him a workaholic. And himself. He put the papers on the edge of the table, collected the scattered pens and pencils, and put them in a black ceramic cup. A ring with a black stone, bright aventurine rosary beads, and a purse he held in his hands, lovingly stroking each of these things, still keeping the warmth of his father. He wanted to keep at least one of them as a memento, but now was not the time. John pulled the drawer of the desk to hide the little things in it, but the drawer wouldn't budge for some reason. Was it locked? The boy looked around for the key. Jacob usually left it right in the keyhole, and John remembered it well, that dainty little key. But now it was nowhere to be found for some reason. The boy stomped hesitantly in place. He could not go to Kathy with such questions now. The poor woman couldn't remember herself from grief, and here he was relaxing. "Kathy, I've been tidying up my dad's place a bit. Have you seen the key to the desk?" He searched his own pockets, found some thin wire, and carefully inserted it into the keyhole. Funny, but it was his father who taught him how to pick locks. Yes, the math professor had his quirks. For example, he could jokingly open any lock. To his son's surprised questions, Jacob usually answered with a short but exhaustively precise phrase. "You never know, son, what skill will come in handy in life?" Perhaps it was the dark side of his father's personality, a passion for adventurism. Though perhaps every scientist is at least a little adventurous at heart, so John was good with locks. He turned the wire in the right direction and heard a slight click. The lock had opened. John pulled out the drawer, about to put his father's treasure in it, but he shuddered and froze at the sight before him. There were 5 glass flasks of nitroglycerin in the drawer, and each of them was already full. "Now that's interesting." The boy said aloud and pushed the box back. "Now that's very interesting." So it wasn't the pill that was out of the house, and Kathy had run off to the drugstore. John knew that his father was always stocking up on medicine, and those clear bottles of nitroglycerin were in the glove compartment of the car, in his jacket pocket, in the kitchen, everywhere. And all of a sudden one day, there wasn't a single pill left in the house. And then all those pills were suddenly found in one desk drawer, a locked drawer, I might add. Isn't that strange? John? Looks like someone just hid the meds they needed and then spent too long wandering around the pharmacy instead of just calling an ambulance. He was reminded of Kathy's old tantrum with her screaming. It was my fault, me. It was a good tantrum, very natural, exemplary. Or maybe she'd done it on purpose, so that no one would ever think she'd had a hand in her father's death. John sank down in his father's chair and rubbed his forehead with force. I'm the one who's stressed out, he thought tiredly. I'm thinking up the hell of it. He thoughtfully went over the aventurine rosary beads in his fingers. He should get some rest, get some sleep, and then think it over again with a clear head. Everything was the same in the drawing room, but there were more people, and the handkerchief in the widow's hands was different, for the old one must have been soaked. You ought to have some tea, John, said Kathy quietly. You haven't eaten or drunk all day. Thanks, Kathy. I don't feel like it. No. She took him by the sleeve. You can't do that, John. Dad would have scolded you for that. You've got to look after your health. Come on, I'll pour you some tea and at least have a sandwich. Kathy walked resolutely into the kitchen, and the boy had no choice but to follow her. Maybe she'd be more comfortable that way. After all, she was used to taking care of her husband, and now she had no one to pour a cup of tea for her. By the way, it can be quite a tragedy when you're used to looking after someone, and now you only have to look after yourself. Are you all right, Kathy? He asked thoughtfully, sitting down at the table. Feeling a little better? Better? I don't know. She took a short breath. It seems better, but then you're alone, and it's like a wolf howls. Drink your tea, I'll get some sugar. John noticed that her hands were shaking, and the sugar spilled past the sugar bowl every now and then, but Kathy didn't seem to notice it. Probably lost in her memories of her father and doesn't see anything around her. Poor thing. Why do I do it? He suggested it. What? Kathy flinched in surprise and sand spilled onto the floor. Sha. Just then he came over. Careful, Kathy. Give me that sugar, I'll do it. I've got to clean it up. He looked down at his feet. I'll do it myself. Where's your broom? No, I'll be right back. She took out a small broom from somewhere, but it wasn't even a broom. It's just a brush. It's only for dusting. It's no good for real cleaning. Kathy, let me. What are you fussing about? Drink your tea, John. I feel better when I'm fussy. I can't do nothing. She bent over, picking up the sugar scattered on the dustpan. Suddenly, John noticed Kathy's pendant on a thin chain falling out from behind the low neckline of her blouse. She shoved it back in with an irritated gesture. But John had time to see the pendant, and he immediately wanted to drink his tea. On Kathy's chain hung the dainty key to the drawer in his father's desk. Kathy, said John, standing up. You know, I just remembered that I promised to pick up my wife from work. I gotta run. You'll be 10 minutes late. It's no big deal, she shrugged. At least you'll get something to eat. No, Kathy. Thank you very much, but I can't. I'll eat at home. I'll see you tomorrow. See you tomorrow. Bye. The funeral's at 10 o'clock, remember? Ah, sure. Emily and I will drive right to the cemetery. Okay. Okay, bye. Call me if you need anything, anytime. He inertially continued to talk to her as if she were his own, and he was surprised at that, But did he realize that he was painfully tempted to make the whole scheme he had not thought up turn out to be a figment of his imagination? She was tired, grieving, and so it came into her head. Oh, how he wanted to say to himself, "John, buddy, you just read your stupid detectives. It's all nonsense, that, and nothing else." But he remembered how the little curled key hung on the chain, how it swayed in the air, and even glittered with the little red pheonite in the headband. He ran outside and inhaled the fresh sea air deeply and greedily. He wanted very much to stand there longer, to breathe in that coolness until his mind cleared, until he could think calmly and soberly. That's it then. He commanded himself sternly. The first thing to do now was to calm down. Go home, dinner, shower, and bed. All thoughts, all reasoning only after the funeral. Kathy, having seen off the last guest, sank tiredly into an armchair and threw off her shoes. On the couch across from her sat the same young man who had taken care of her all evening. "Are you tired?" he asked. "Are you tired of the condolences?" That's the word. And they're not condolers, they're freeloaders. They took out the whole fridge, and at least one of them brought me something to eat. It's not a holiday, it's not customary. Kathy stretched out her legs and wiggled her stiff toes. I'd lived with Jacob for years, but I'd never realized he had so many acquaintances, and half of them I'd seen for the first time today. Yeah, before I forget. "David, I need to clean up Jacob's office, or after the funeral the mourners will come. Can I take this as a memento of our unforgettable Jacob?" You wouldn't say no. And John will probably want something to remember him by. So you look there, okay? David got up readily. "Okay, Kathy, whatever you say. But you'd better do it yourself. You know what to hide and what to leave in plain sight." Go, she grumbled. "I'll be there in 5 minutes." David shrugged his shoulders and went to the office door. Kathy gave him a thoughtful look. Who the hell had asked her to get involved with him? What a man. For 5 years he had pretended to be a relative of hers so that he could meet her unhindered. 5 years of sharing her with another man, and never once tried, never even tried to change anything. It was the only thing he was capable of, always hanging around and telling tales of his great love, and no jealousy. What jealousy? No respect for yourself. If your woman sleeps with another man, let her sleep. Married to another man? So what? I'll be a lover. And for the general public, I'll call myself a brother, you slug. If only she'd figured him out sooner. "Kathy," David called out to her from the study. "It's all tidied up. You probably cleaned it up yourself and forgot about it." "Cleaned up? What are you telling me? There's papers all over the desk, calculations. You can't tell whether I was married to a mathematician or an accountant," mumbled Kathy on the way to the office. "That's what they say. If you want something done well, you have to do it yourself there." She stopped on the threshold, looking at the perfectly cleaned desk. No mess. Papers stacked, pencils, pens, rulers in their place. But who? David grinned at her. Can you think of anyone who could have gotten in here and started tinkering? Besides you, of course. John? That's right. David nodded seriously. Take a pie off the shelf. John. What's there to do here, John? Kathy didn't notice herself fumbling with the key pendant around her neck. You know what, David? I'm tired. Pick me up at 9 o'clock, will you? Now go. You've got to get some sleep, too, because tomorrow is the second act of the play, The Inconsolable Widow and Her Loving Brother. He gave her a short, wary glance. Somehow she was worried, for they were going to spend the rest of the evening together. And then all of a sudden there it was. She was tired. "Something wrong, Kathy?" "No." "What makes you think that?" She tried to speak calmly, even carelessly, but David saw her lips press together for a moment into a tight, stern line. Nervous, after all. She is very, very nervous. "I wonder what it's about. Can I at least have a coffee before I go?" he asked. "Or are you going to kick me out like that?" Kathy waved her hand toward the kitchen. "Drink, but you find it yourself, brew it yourself, and I'll check the place out. See if anything's missing. You can expect anything from these scholarly husbands and their chickens and wives." David smiled. He found not only coffee, but also cookies in the kitchen, and took a piece of cheese and butter out of the refrigerator. Since he couldn't count on a full dinner tonight, at least he'd have that. After all, he'd been acting as a comforter to the unfortunate widow all day, quiet and serious, and as a grieving relative should be, he'd been hungry all day. What kind of stupid etiquette is that? If you're hungry, you're not worried? You'd think grief would shut down your physiology. At least going to the bathroom doesn't violate these ridiculous unwritten laws. Kathy was so furiously rummaging through her late husband's study that David could hear her rattling cabinet doors, opening and closing drawers, all to the sound of endless mutterings. "Kathy? There's Kathy." He grinned, spreading butter on his bread. She'd always been like that, a little volcano, a hurricane. That must have been what had attracted him to her long ago. How many years had it been? 5? 4? No, 4.5. David remembered that he and Kathy had met in some awful grocery store with narrow aisles and slippery mopped floors. Then she'd swooped down on him, endless yogurt, cottage cheese, and no human food. "Taking care of your figure?" He smiled, helping her gather her purchases. "You must be a photo model or a dancer?" The girl looked at him carefully, with such a deep scanning gaze that he felt uncomfortable for a moment. It was a mistake for him to talk to her, but she smiled openly and a little helplessly at him. Where had the X-ray look gone? Now in front of David stood just a sweet and very confused girl. She used to be a photo model, but now she's long gone. And now you are, and now, the girl laughed lightheartedly. "I am already too old, a retired photo model, but no one pays me a pension. I'm in graduate school." "How?" Now he was confused. "How old are you?" "You're no more than 20. And you say you're 22. That's already retirement age for modeling. So still for modeling, I'm quite an old grandmother, but the habit of looking after myself has been preserved since those distant times. Well, that is, eat nothing and drink water all the time." "Why water?" David was surprised. "It's good for your skin." They left the store together and circled the city until nightfall, talking about everything and laughing loudly. David walked beside the funny black-haired girl, and more than anything else in the world was afraid of what she would say. "Well, that's it. I've got to go. And they're going to break up. Maybe forever." And he'd never had as much fun with anyone as he had with her. "There's my house," said Kathy, pointing to a shabby gray 5-story building. "Just the sight of it made me feel homesick. How do you live here?" He mumbled confusedly and immediately realized that he had done something stupid. "I'm sorry," but Kathy winked at him understandingly. "I'm used to it. It's horrible, of course, but it's still a roof over my head. Invite me in for coffee?" He made up his mind. "I want to be with you a little longer." The girl shook her head. "No. Seriously," she said. "We're almost strangers. What if you're a maniac?" "Reasonable," he agreed. It gave him an unknown joy that she was refusing to ask him out, not because she didn't like him, but simply for safety reasons. Still, He put both hands on her shoulders, ran his thumb over the delicate maiden's cheek. "I really want to see you again." "When?" she whispered. "Tomorrow." So began their passionate, crazy romance, the mystery of which David to this day, to unravel, could not solve. What was so unusual about her? A cheerful girl, easygoing. I mean, how many of those are there? But there was some special fun and lightness with her, a special appearance unlike anything else. Kathy knew how to emphasize her attractive features and did it very elegantly, without any vulgarity. A little eyeliner, a little lipstick, haircut bob, too, was not chosen by chance. It was just enough to emphasize the beauty of a thin, long neck and emphasize the chiseled, sharp chin, but with all this beauty, Kathy was not. Moreover, David had seen her washed and undressed, and for some reason the charm did not dissipate. So it was love. So he decided then. They spent together the most serene few months of his life. Then Kathy suddenly shocked him with the startling news that she was getting married. "He's old, of course, and a bore, not like you, but he's rich, and he's a household name in scientific circles. And you and I are going to stay the same, don't you think?" "What do you mean the same?" David asked sadly. "You'll be married to someone other than me." Kathy shook her head irritably, blowing away a strand of hair that had fallen into her face. She didn't want to answer, or maybe there was nothing to answer. And then David burst into tears. "Explain to me, finally, why, if you and I are together, if you, as you say, love me more than life, then why do you sleep with an old goat? And you're going to marry him? Why, Kathy, for him and not for me? What would you and I live on? And where?" "In a dormitory where the two of us are already cramped. And the money? Where would the money come from? A shared life, a family, it's not just having coffee together once a day. It's breakfasts, lunches, dinners, and also payment for utilities. It's spending on clothes, shoes, furnishings. While you and I would have been promoted, stood on our feet, it would have to wait 5 years, if not more. And here it's all ready, come and get it. And an old husband to boot." David reminded her. "Tell me, how will you differ from an ordinary prostitute? Only that you'll have only one client, but a nasty and old one." But Kathy didn't want to take that as a serious argument. "It's fine if he's old. Think about it, how long will he live? We could suffer a little, but then we'd have an inheritance." "What an inheritance? You could buy a house in Italy, live there, and never need anything. It's like the lottery, we'll win the grand prize, and you still have doubts. What if?" David didn't like Kathy's idea at all, but she spoke so enthusiastically, so fervently, that it was hard not to believe her. "Your old grandfather knows about us." "He won't." The girl clapped her hands. "I've already thought of everything. According to legend, you're my cousin, and we've been very close and best friends since childhood, so no one will suspect anything." "Okay," he sighed. "Since you think it's better this way?" She really thought so. A month later, he stood in the wedding hall congratulating the newlyweds. Kathy, in a dainty white Channel suit, with a light veil over her face, seemed suddenly 5 years older to David. No longer a girl, not his Kathy, but a cruel woman. The kind of woman who always knows how to live and will not doubt her rightness for a second. Such aunts, even over time, become not too well fed, and their intonation becomes imperious. They always talk down, even in a seemingly friendly conversation. Kathy had not yet acquired all these traits, but all was yet to come, as they say. He was not pleased to congratulate either her or her shining with pride young husband. David didn't stay at the wedding for long. He rushed home shortly after the third toast, fully convinced that his and Kathy's story was over for good. He spent a whole week missing his beloved and convincing himself that the light, airy girl he'd fallen in love with was gone. She had died somewhere on the way to the marriage institution, and the one who had smiled at the wedding guests, smiling and drinking champagne, just looked like her. But towards the end of the week, the doorbell rang, and David, opening it, saw the former Kathy on the doorstep. In a beret and a black dress, with her pouty lips tinted, and he gasped with joy. He was so happy to meet his Kathy that without a word he embraced her and held her tightly to him. It was as if she had come back from a long journey, so beloved and real. "Don't pay attention to all this nonsense," she said, hiding her wedding ring in her pocket. "We'll still see each other like before." Yes, like before. Except it wasn't like before. If only because now we couldn't walk down the street holding hands, we couldn't spend nights together. Everything, or almost everything, was forbidden. Kathy's character had also changed. She was obviously disappointed that her husband was still alive, and for some reason she took it out on David. "What's it got to do with me?" He was surprised when the girl once again made him a scandal. "I was against your marriage at all. It was you who insisted. Don't you remember?" "I didn't know he'd last this long." Kathy yelled back, "He's so many years older than me. I thought a year, maybe 2. Turns out there's nothing wrong with his health at all. Only recently his heart's been acting up. What do you want me to do? Kill him now?" David asked. Kathy only waved away, and her face was clearly reproachful. "What can you do? You can't even squash a cockroach." David couldn't understand what she was blaming him for, so he decided that it was probably the simplest thing in the world. Kathy is angry at her husband for his unfortunate for her longevity, but she cannot give vent to her anger at home, and she needs to get it out. So she takes it out on him, David. She doesn't expect him to kill her distinguished professor, does she? He was just finishing his sandwich when Kathy appeared in the kitchen. "Are you still here?" she asked. She was clutching what looked like vials in her fist. "Well, you'll find your own way out." "I'm going to bed. I'm tired." She threw what she held in her hand into the trash can and went to the bathroom. David, calmly waiting for her to close the door, looked at the trash can. What looked like glass ampoules turned out to be flasks with pills inside. Nitroglycerin. He read the name. Some of the flasks had more pills, others less. The simplest explanation was that Kathy had cleaned the deceased's office, found his medications, and since they were no longer needed, had decided to throw them away. Except, how does that square with her excitement? To the fact that she deliberately kicked him out of the office. I mean, she clearly wanted him out of the office. So she must have had some secrets in there. Now I know what they were. And most importantly, how does this correlate with her words that her husband died just when she, Kathy, ran to the pharmacy for nitroglycerin, which was not in the house? What's this then? David dressed and hurried out of the apartment, thinking for the first time that perhaps the professor's death was not as accidental as it might seem at first glance. John hated funerals. When he had stood at his mother's coffin as a 14-year-old, he had thought for the first time that only those closest to him should bury a person. And please don't do that. Pay your last respects to the deceased, support grieving relatives, walk the last journey. He thought about the fact that all these people who approached his mother's coffin, in fact, did not feel even a tenth of the horror and despair that he himself felt. But they were all coming to him with condolences, and he had to thank them. Though most of all he wanted to send them to hell, and only his father's warm hand, warming his shoulder ever so reliably, helped him keep within the bounds of politeness. People were walking from the cemetery, talking among themselves, discussing the details of John's mother's death and seeming to savor the story. John was disgusted and hurt. He shrank back to his father, and only when they were finally alone in the car, he couldn't stand it. "What's this circus for, Dad? They're dragging these flowers, saying these words, and then they're walking out of the cemetery, and they're all discussing how she died, how she felt." Dad thought for a while. Deep down, he shared his son's feelings, but it wasn't worth talking about right now. Why toughen the child further? "It seems to me," he said, "that this is how they express their own fear of death. They talk about someone else's death, hoping to understand. What is it anyway? Can't do their academic research elsewhere." Angrily through John, "At least not in front of loved ones." Jacob smiled sadly. "Don't judge them so harshly, son. They're only human, they're scared, and they're trying to talk down their fear, and they're happy to be alive, but they're genuinely grieving for your mom. Believe me, I don't believe it." John said grimly and turned away to the window. The wake, from which there was no escape, had finally convinced him. It was all a farce. At first, the people still talked about their mother, but then the talk began to drift in another direction. They discussed some purchases. Someone told about dreaming about the dead. Jacob shook his son's hand under the table. "Don't demand too much of them." The sheikh seemed to speak. "They're just people, remember?" John remembered. As he grew older, he realized that he had indeed wanted too much from them, wanted them all to grieve as much as he himself did. It wasn't fair, of course, but still, he still considered the ritual of funerals and mass farewells to the dead to be hypocrisy. And now he had to go to bury his father, and no one to put a hand on his shoulder. "Are you ready, Emily?" He called to his wife. She came to him at once, dressed modestly in black, her hair slicked back. "Yes, John. Shall we go?" Before leaving, she hugged her husband tightly, didn't let go of his hand the whole time they were down in the elevator and walking to the car. "And the flowers?" Suddenly she asked. "We didn't buy flowers, John." He smiled forcefully at his wife. "Don't worry. Dad hated those flowers. He thought there was nothing to bring as a present to a dead man. It's better, when it warms up, we'll plant live ones and trees on his grave, plant chestnuts next to it. It will be beautiful, and birds will fly in." The wife nodded and touched her husband's palm. "John, my darling, you should have told me." "Tell me what?" Emily shook her head. "I don't know. But you didn't seem to be the same last night. You seemed focused, like you were preparing for battle." "What happened?" The boy bit his lip. Should I tell her, or shouldn't worry her? I'd have to figure it out first. He started, hoping Emily wouldn't hear the falseness in his voice. "I wanted to surprise you. Last week, I went to the construction market, got everything for the repair, a new fork, wallpaper. Who knew this would happen? And I've already arranged with the decorating crew. They should start tomorrow. I thought we'd stay at my dad's for a week, but now I don't know what to do. Do you think it would be convenient to ask Kathy to take us in?" "Would it be convenient?" Emily looked thoughtfully out of the window. "I don't know, John. It's kind of like prying into a person's life, but on the other hand, maybe she'll feel better if we're around. At least she'll have someone to talk to." "I'll try to talk to her," John said confidently. "I'll just have to find the right moment to do it." There were already many people in the cemetery, and it was not an easy task to see Kathy in this moving black crowd. John struggled to reach his father's coffin with one hand, holding his wife's arm tightly so that she would not be pushed or shoved away. And at last he saw Kathy. She was standing at the headboard of the coffin, with her unchanging, either brother or some other relative sticking out beside her. John couldn't remember his name. They hadn't even crossed paths that often, maybe 3 or 4 times at some common family festivities. What was his name? Something with the letter A, Emily. Do you remember his name? He asked his wife in a whisper. David. Emily also whispered. Kathy herself stood as still as a statue. Her eyes were hidden behind dark glasses. In her hands she held a large bouquet of dark red roses. The strong wind made the petals crumble and fall to the snow like drops of someone's fresh blood. The sight made John uncomfortable, and he shifted his gaze to the coffin. Have a safe journey, Father. Thank you for being with me. You will be, won't you? He thought as one of the father's co-workers pushed his own pathos-filled speech over the casket. Something about the fact that their whole team had suffered an irreparable loss in the person of Jacob, a brilliant scientist, a reliable comrade, and just a good man. I just wanted to say what a great time I had with you. You taught me how to climb trees and pick all kinds of locks. Remember when you and I went to Hawaii? In October, running away like 2 kids from school. You got me a certificate saying I had chicken pox and I was quarantined, and you brought one to work. They gave you a bulletin. The ocean was cold, but we went swimming anyway, Dad, remember? And we didn't even catch a cold because it was great. You told me that. That was the best vacation of my life. Dad, I'm so glad you enjoyed it. I'm so proud that you had a good time with me. And it was the best vacation for me too, being around you. And how good, how wonderful that we were always together. I don't know another person at all who could work as hard as you did. You've often scolded me for being obsessed with my work and never noticed that you're the same way yourself, only you're so much better than me, Dad. You know why? I realized it a long time ago. You're better because you like to work and I like to make money. And no one's ever had such a good and proper vacation. We came back from Hawaii, so tanned, so full of energy. At school, the teachers couldn't believe I was sick and not at a resort, but they wouldn't talk about the certificates. And you and I had enough energy until the summer vacation. What was my summer vacation, Dad? You and I moved to a summer cottage for the whole summer, and you weren't lazy to go to work in the city every day, just so I could breathe fresh air and eat fruits and vegetables. Remember when I told you I liked the attic, and you set up a whole room for me there? You hung a hammock, carpeted the floor, threw pillows, even brought a telescope from somewhere. Do you remember the basket? Our food elevator system. Every morning you'd fill the basket with breakfast for me, and then you'd go to work. And attached to the handle of that basket was the end of a rope. The other one was in my attic. I'd wake up, pull the rope, and get my breakfast. I loved it, Daddy. When you're still sleepy and you're lying down, and you pull the basket in, and the aromas of fresh bread waft up from there, mind-blowing. Honestly, Dad, it's still my favorite smell. No one knows how to bake bread like you, Dad. I grew up tasting a lot of things. Now all these kinds of breads are newfangled. Compared to the bread you bake, but with butter and a slice of cheese, how delicious. It's a feast, Father, and no one can prove to me that there are better dishes, Dad. John felt tears pricking his eyes. He tilted his head back to keep them from spilling out. Not now. In the same second, he felt Emily warmly and gently press her cheek against his shoulder. He squeezed her narrow palm harder. Dad, you dream about me? Okay, just once in a while. John, the wife whispered. Now we must go to the coffin and say goodbye. She gently pushed him forward. John approached the coffin and forced himself to look into the face of the dead man. How much does death change people? It was as if the person lying in the coffin wasn't even a person, but a plastic mannequin. Did Kathy hire makeup artists? Whatever was in that coffin had nothing to do with his father. Dad, I'm sorry, okay? I want to remember you alive, and this isn't you. I'm sorry. John touched his father's hand, covered in a white shroud, and quickly turned back to his wife. I can't. He whispered to her. I can't, Emily. It'll all be over soon, honey, she said quietly. John looked for Kathy with his eyes. David was supporting her under her elbow, leading her toward the coffin. Without removing her glasses, she leaned over and kissed her late husband on the forehead. There was a whisper in the crowd. She should at least take off her glasses. Shameless. She's burying her husband, such a man, and she's dressed up like she's going to a reception. Shut up. The girl can barely stand on her feet from grief. Is it grief? John grinned. He remembered his mother's funeral and his father's words. Don't judge them harshly, son. They are only human. Kathy, still accompanied by the faithful David, returned to her seat. Throwing a handful of earth into the grave, John immediately turned to his wife. Come on, Emily, let's go home. And the wake? Reminded his wife. Oh, I'd completely forgotten. John shook his head in despair. There's a wake. Here comes Kathy. He turned and saw the tall figure of Kathy right in front of him. David was standing tactfully a little farther away. Are you going to the wake? She asked. The wind ruffled her black hair, and the hem of her wide black coat fluttered in the wind. John remembered that fur piece. His father had given it to his wife on their first wedding anniversary and had dragged his son shopping for a long time before that. Well, help me pick it out. I don't know anything about gifts for ladies. Where are we going to go? Said John, by an effort of will, driving away memories. We'll go, of course. Do you want to come with us? No, thank you. She thanked him discreetly. David can drive me. I'll meet you at the cafe. This time the wake was quiet and very intelligent. Either John had a very threatening look, or just the environment, Jacob, consisted of 95% of people who had received an excellent upbringing. After all, scientists, the world of science, it is somehow unseemly for them to discuss new refrigerators at the wake of colleagues. Or maybe, John thought, maybe it's just me growing up. They eat with appetite and drink a lot, and I don't care. He really didn't care about anything. No, not really. It was tiresome, and he wanted to leave quickly. He refused to drink. But how could he? David wondered. When John resolutely took his hand away from his hand with a misty bottle of vodka. Not our way, John. It's a memorial. I'm driving. John cut him off and poured himself some juice. Kathy gave him a disapproving glance across the table, but refrained from commenting. That's a good girl. John praised her mentally. She was no longer wearing yesterday's chain around her neck, he noticed. Kathy, on arriving home, gladly got rid of the morning dress and changed into a brightly colored robe. She wanted to sing with joy. It was over. It's over, it's over. She purred and immediately cut herself short. All, but not all. True, now she was a real widow. Her husband's funeral and wake were behind her, and such a trifle as the necessity of wearing mourning, appearing in society, it is right such trifles. But now this very society will not be crowded into her apartment, and she does not need to hourly in front of everyone to portray a grief-stricken widow. But there was one more obstacle separating her from complete and unconditional happiness. There was John. In fact, she was lucky, one might say. John himself, having taken her aside for a minute in a cafe, called her aside and told her about the forthcoming renovation of her and Emily's apartment, and asked her to stay here for a week. Kathy readily agreed. "Thank you, John," she said with a sad smile on her lips. "I wanted to ask you to come and stay with me, but I was too shy, and this way it will be easier for me at least." She covered her eyes with the palm of her hand, as if trying to hold back tears. There would be someone to talk to, someone to remember Jacob. John's move was good for her. If he was here, it would be easier to get rid of him. First, she would know his schedule, and that was important. Secondly, it would be easier to get rid of that stupid Emily of his, and that was just as important. And thirdly, that was where it got tricky. Kathy went over all the options in her mind and had to admit she couldn't do without an accomplice. After all, another dead person in this apartment in less than a month. No, even the dumbest of people would get suspicious. So there's only one way out. John has to be disposed of on the street. And how do you do that? A random fight with a drunken thug? No. Kathy pursed her lips in a squeamish grimace. There's bound to be blood, murder weapon, fingerprints. Oh, and someone might notice something, call the police or rush to help. Too many variables, as her late husband would say. Too many, and it has to be done cleanly and preferably quickly. So it's an accident. Catch John when he's on foot and make sure he doesn't see the car coming at him. I'd have to get David involved after all, she sighed. Of course she didn't want to involve him, but what could she do if he was the only one she could trust? On the other hand, she thought it would be easier to dump him when she got the inheritance she wanted. Kathy had no intention of sharing it with David or anyone else, especially since David was getting on her nerves. And if everything worked out the way she planned, it would be enough to scare the slug with the police, and he'd be off her back for good. No, David, that's a good one. It's great. John moved in the next morning with Emily and the dog Beryl. Why Beryl? Asked Kathy, looking at the black as pitch dog who was happily running around the apartment with them. Because he is our black gold, explained Emily. Kathy, you tell me if there's anything you need help with. Do you want me to cook dinner and you can lie down and rest? No way, Kathy snorted. We'll just order a delivery and be done with it. Look at the way that nimble girl tried to push the landlady away. She'll cook dinner, won't she? She never really liked Emily. Kathy remembered how John had brought this country girl from the backwoods to her and her father, and had announced at once that he was going to marry her. Jacob extended his hand to the girl with a friendly smile. Nice to meet you, Emily. Will you have dinner with us? And Kathy couldn't take her eyes off the girl's feet. Felt boots be damned. She was wearing real gray, ugly boots. Stop staring, it's embarrassing. Her husband whispered in her ear. When John helped the girl to take off her shabby coat, underneath she was wearing a no less interesting outfit. A mohair sweater with elbows outstretched, and for some reason it was tucked into a long woolen skirt. After sitting through half the dinner, Kathy went to the kitchen, and before she did so, she looked at her husband expressively. Give me a hand. I've got a duck roasting in there. Well, what are you unhappy about? Asked Jacob, entering the kitchen. Kathy tightly closed the door and turned sharply to her husband. What are you happy about? She asked in a fierce whisper. Did you see who he brought? He's a hick. I didn't even know there were such people in the world. You'll be ashamed of yourself in front of your friends. Your son and that fool. Jacob smiled conciliatingly. Stop, Kathy. Poverty is not a vice, you know. And John is not a poor boy. He'll dress the girl up. I like her all right, but I like her. She's kind, she's not mean, and she's in love with John. She can't take her eyes off him." "Fool," Kathy said with feeling, and she went out of the kitchen. And now this unwashed hillbilly was offering to help her with dinner? No, not at all. I don't know if she washes her hands before she cooks. And this one, your dog? Kathy's changed the subject. Is he street trained? Of course, John smiled and scratched the dog behind the ear. "We walk him 3 times a day." "Right, Beryl?" "I see." Kathy said, "Well, make yourselves comfortable. I thought I'd give you your old room, John. We took the bed out of it, but there's a sofa. But if you're used to sleeping on a bed, I guess, the couch will be fine for us." Emily said softly, "Please, Kathy, don't worry about a thing. You'll be fine with a dirty rug." Kathy thought, smiling at the girl, "And so will your dog." The day for John and Emily passed in attempts to settle down in at least relative comfort. The sofa Kathy had mentioned was creaky and squeaky, and the springs were digging right into the upholstery, which made them feel the sharpest. "Trouble," John grimaced. "Maybe it would be easier to put an inflatable bed." "Where to?" Emily gestured around the room. "There's not enough space. We'll have to put the couch somewhere, and I don't want to bother Catch with these questions. We're already crammed in. Why don't we just put a blanket on the couch and make it more comfortable?" "Let's do it." John agreed with a sigh and mentally scolded himself for his haste. He had started this move. But why? He didn't know it himself now. Let's say he suspected Kathy. But where's the proof of her guilt? It's silly to hope she hasn't cleaned up the evidence. She must have emptied all the pills out of the drawer by now, and the key. But there's no telling where the key is. She could have thrown it away, lost it. Just put it back in the lock. What's he got to do with the key? It's not a key. A key by itself doesn't mean anything. I guess the only way to try and find out the truth is to make her panic. If she starts flailing around, then there's still a chance. After dinner, Emily went to walk Beryl, and Kathy and John were left alone. "Shall I do the dishes?" he suggested. Kathy shook her head. "The dishwasher will do the dishes." "I think I'll probably go to bed, John." "I'm sorry, okay?" She was getting tired fast. She got up and headed for the bedroom. "Why did you hide the nitroglycerin?" John asked in her back. Kathy stopped. "What?" she asked again. "John, what are you doing?" "I went into his office the day my father died. The desk drawer was locked with a key," he answered calmly. "I opened it. I know how to do that." There were several flasks of nitroglycerin in the drawer, all of them already opened. "So you collected them from your father's pockets, put them in the drawer, and locked it. And when he got sick, you supposedly ran to the drugstore to get the medicine, but really you were just waiting for him to die. That's funny." Without turning around, Kathy said, "Very interesting and very funny. Since you've decided to cheer me up, then maybe you can tell me where you got your conclusions from." "If only because you said your father complained of a heart condition around 11 o'clock and you ran to the pharmacy. And the autopsy report says he died around 1:30. If you found him dead when you got back, that begs the question, where were you for 2.5 hours? The nearest drugstore was a 5-minute walk. It was closed," said Kathy grimly. "The pharmacist had gone somewhere else." "It's possible," nodded John, "but the next pharmacy is a stone's throw away, and there's another one around the corner. This place is full of them. And none of them had nitroglycerin? Or were they all closed?" Kathy suddenly smiled and went back to her desk. "I don't know why you suddenly decided to play detective," she said, "but you're not very good at it. Anyway, I was at the drugstore. And by the way, What makes you think I'm the one who put the medicine under the lock? It could have been your father. After all, it was his office and his desk. She's bluffing, he thought, or she's trying to play the bank because she can't prove she's not involved. I think you locked the drawer, said he, because I saw the key to the drawer that day in your possession on a chain around your neck. Kathy laughed, a deliberately loud, shrill laugh. Are you delirious, John? She said. I'm not angry with you just because you're in grief as I am, but let's say no more about it. Good night. The key turned in the keyhole, and Emily entered the apartment with Beryl. On her hair, as well as dog hair, sparkled unmelted snowflakes. Kathy locked herself in her bedroom and pulled her cell phone out of her pocket. She was about to dial David, but changed her mind at the last moment. She couldn't. Speaking out loud was now becoming dangerous. She would have to limit herself to texting. Tomorrow, at about 800 hours. Don't call me back, she texted. David has to figure it out. Winter is getting colder and colder, David thought, pulling his jacket tighter around himself. The old car had no stove, no heater, nothing for comfort. No wonder. David had gone to the nearest village a couple of days ago, when Kathy had told him of her plans and bought the rotten machine from the local alcoholics. He had to pay for it with a case of liquor, which David thought was unreasonably expensive for such a wreck, especially if we take into account that it was needed only once. Anyway, there was big money ahead if Kathy didn't let him down. And she can. Unfortunately, David had long ago lost trust in her, and after the funeral of her professor, he was amazed to find that he had no love for her at all. Oh, Kathy, Kathy! David was sorry for that hot and tender feeling, which more and more gave way to wariness and fear. Fear, too. David considered himself a man of flexible, let us call it moral principles, but he was not a fool after all. The haste with which Kathy was trying to get rid of another claimant to the honorable professor's inheritance directly indicated that he, David, was not mistaken in his suspicions. Kathy had indeed played no small part in her husband's demise and was very much afraid that someone would guess it. John must have figured it out on his own account. Where is he, by the way? It was getting unpleasant to be stranded in this windswept car. Heads up, a text message from Kathy. David instantly picked himself up and somehow reminded himself of the perfect killing machine. Fast, precise, ready for immediate action. The door opened wide and Beryl leaped out into the yard with a deafeningly loud bark. From the outside, it looked like a big black dog dragging his master on a leash. Now we must act, David said to himself. Beryl, with his intuitive canine sense, was the first to sense danger. A second before the brakes squealed, he rushed forward, and only thanks to that the car only hit John, throwing him aside on the lawn. Fuck you. I don't have a second chance anyway, David cursed. He drove the car further, squeezing all he could out of the long-suffering car. In a dozen miles there will be a forest belt, and there is a good deep ravine. We'll have to dump the already unwanted car there. And only then, but not before, should I call Kathy, find out how things were going, and go back to town. Beryl poked his master with his nose, but he didn't react. The dog scurried around, barking loudly in the neighborhood. Kathy looked out the window and smiled. Well done, David. He's not such an idiot after all. He just needs competent guidance. No brains of his own, but a great performer. Beryl kept barking, loudly and hysterically, running up to passers-by and grabbing them by the hem of their jackets. In a minute, a crowd had gathered around John. Someone crouched over him, trying to feel for a pulse. Someone was already calling an ambulance. Emily, attracted by the loud barking, also looked out the window and, seeing her husband lying on the ground, rushed to the door. "He'll be fine," the EMT assured her. "Maybe a couple of fractures, but that's nothing compared to what could have happened. And bones heal." "Can I come with you?" Emily asked, lost. "You don't have to. You'll get a call soon. Go home. Don't worry. Your husband will be fine." Kathy stood at the front door, waiting for Emily and Beryl to get off the elevator. "Well," she shouted, her voice ringing with tension. "For example, if John is dead, she is still 6 months away from receiving the inheritance. And for those 6 months, Kathy has to sit here quietly, not to get involved in any trouble. In this case, the appearance of David may well confuse her plans. Having in his hands such dirt on her, he can easily begin to blackmail her. And blackmail is a dangerous thing. Poor Kathy could lose all her money at once, just to avoid going to jail. And if John is alive, but in that scenario, David is also redundant. If the guy survived, then Kathy will have to think of a new way to send his son to his scientist father, and David with his dirt, and the opportunity to use it, automatically becomes the #1 troublemaker. So it goes like this. Kathy will figure out that she doesn't need a man who doesn't know much about anything, which means she'll decide to get rid of him, just as she did her husband and then his son. I'm so screwed, David thought. It turns out that the only way to avoid a sudden death is to. First, however, it would be good to clear up a few things. First of all, was John alive? Kathy decided to devote today to taking care of herself. She didn't want to call her favorite spa salon, after all. Her husband was a famous man, and surely everyone in the salon, from the director to the last masseuse, knew about his death. In person, of course, they will smile, as it is supposed to servants, but behind the eyes will be judging. No, she didn't need any more gossip. So she would have to make do on her own. Kathy drew herself a warm bath with a romantic bubble bath and sank into the water with pleasure. Joe Dasson's soft, ingratiating voice sounded in her headphones. Everything's going to be all right. Yes, everything was going to be just fine. Kathy closed her eyes and imagined her future home by the sea. She would wake up every morning and go out on the balcony, listen to the shimmer of the waves, and fall asleep at night, breathing in the salty sea breeze. And her balcony will be just right. Not some cage, a meter by meter, and a huge lined with colorful ceramics. She would have a big wicker sofa with lots of cushions, and in the evening she would light lanterns on it, and in the bedroom she would have a spacious bed with a canopy. Kathy smiled as she imagined how seductive she would look through the sheer fabric of the canopy. Tanned on the snow-white sheets and so fragile and thin on the giant bed, her new lovers would go crazy over this sight. Speaking of lovers, she'd liked tall brunettes since she was young. David, in general, also quite suited her tastes, but everything eventually gets boring. In Italy, she'll have some 20-year-old Mario. Let him have blue eyes, an exuberant isn't-he black mane, and a dark gold tan. He'll have a muscular body and strong arms. He will love her all night long, and in the morning she will send him home and fall asleep tired but happy. And when she wakes up, she will not immediately realize whether it was a real night or just a dream. David saw Emily sitting on the swing from afar. Beryl was enjoying himself at the feet of his mistress and looked at everyone who passed by. I wondered why she was sitting there, but she doesn't seem to be crying, so there is a reason to think that John is still alive. "Good afternoon, Emily," he said. "Hello. Are you out for some air?" The girl shook her head. "No, Kathy just kicked me out." Well, Kathy, I didn't realize you were so predictable. Where's John?" "At the hospital," she just answered. "He was hit by a car this morning right here in the yard. But he got off lightly, you might say." "Emily." David squatted down in front of her, scratching behind the dog's ear. "But why don't you go home?" "Oh, yes, I forgot. Kathy told me you were having your apartment remodeled." "No, it's not the renovations, David. It's just that she was so rude to me, and I don't know. I'm afraid of something. Maybe she'll say something mean about me to John, or I don't know. But here's the thing," said he, rising to his feet. "Let's go together to this queen. I give you my word that after I talk to her, she won't even dare to look at you sideways. No, I don't. Come." He held out his hand to her. It was time to end this story. The games had gone on too long, and it was a pity for the girl. She was a casualty in these Kathy games. Emily reluctantly got up from the swing. Beryl immediately jumped up, looking questioningly at his mistress. "Come along, my good man," quietly said the girl, but the dog was already interested in something else. He, attentively perked up his ears and eagerly sniffing, looked somewhere at the end of the yard. "What is it?" But the dog was already tearing off the leash, and in a moment burst into loud, joyful barking. John appeared from around the corner. A couple of bruises and a broken rib. He shouted when he saw his wife. "Meet the wounded man, Emily. Shall we tell him?" Emily asked softly. David grinned. "Let's do this." Kathy didn't want to leave the bathroom, but the suspicious rattle of the key in the lock would make anyone nervous. Honestly, she'd change all the locks on the doors tomorrow. After all, she had 6 months to live here before the inheritance, and it's better to live those 6 months in peace without any upheaval. "Kathy," Sharon's voice came from the hallway. "Are you home?" Kathy threw her silk robe over her shoulders and didn't bother to wrap it too tightly. "John." She rushed over to him. "How are you, darling?" "I almost went crazy. I was just about to go to the hospital to see you." "It's okay," he smiled. "Just a broken rib and a couple of bruises." "You poor thing." She touched his chest with her fingertips. "Does it hurt a lot?" "It's nothing." "Where's Emily?" "She's gone." Kathy answered with her eyes downcast. She tugged at the hem of her robe as if in excitement, which made it open more. "You see, John, I didn't know how to tell you, but anyway, the day Jacob's heart went bad, it was for a reason. He found out that my brother David and your wife were, they." "What they?" John asked coldly. "What don't I know?" "They." Kathy's voice trailed off. They've been in a long, relationships, you know?" "No." "Speak up, Kathy." All right. David and Emily are lovers, and Jacob, he had a heart attack when he found out." "Ah, John." She pressed her palms to her temples. "I'm so ashamed. How could this be?" "And today, Emily, after they took you to the hospital, told me that today was no accident. She and David plotted this hit and run together. It was an attempted murder they'd planned together. They wanted to get rid of you first and then me. Well, who'd doubt it, because it would have been to their advantage. Then they'd have nothing to stop them from getting the inheritance, Jacob, and going to live abroad." "Yeah, John, you should have heard what she was saying here. Laughing, cheering, shouting that it would all be hers alone in the end. And I couldn't take it. I told her I wouldn't let her do that to Jacob's son, and I told her to get out. Yes, John, honey, I demanded that she get out of our house. It's your house, too. And this dishonorable, immoral, lying woman let her go outside to her David, wherever? I don't care. but I don't want her to set foot in this house. It's bad enough that I lost my husband because of her and David's meanness. They can't expect me to let them lay a finger on you. Never. It's never gonna happen. Oh, John. Kathy clutched her eyes shut, as if trying to keep the tears from spilling over. I'm so ashamed of you, John. I'm so ashamed that David is my brother. What an interesting version of events. Now shall we hear mine? David's voice came from behind the door. He stepped into the hallway, and Emily came in after him. What are you doing here? Kathy almost choked. I'm sorry, Kathy. David waved his hands theatrically. When you're playing with someone as dishonest as you, it's silly not to have a safety net, isn't it? He took his cell phone out of his pocket and held it up. Shall we hear my version of what happened? He pressed the play button. They must have been talking somewhere on the street, because at first nothing but the noise of passing cars could be heard, and then it got quiet. There was one last step left, just one. Don't you want to help me? A hoarse Kathy voice said in the silence. Don't you realize that the inheritance, which is a lot of money, is almost in our hands, especially since my hubby's been so lucky to get away with it, and anyway, do you have anything to do with it? David's voice asked. You're the one who helped him to the other side, aren't you? You don't have to worry about that. Jacob is gone. He's buried, that's it. It doesn't matter how or why he died. Even if I helped him, so what? Does it make a difference? No. So what difference does it make? I'm telling you none of it matters anymore. It doesn't matter. So you don't think it matters? Yes, and you should too. All we have to do now is eliminate John, and we've got the money. But I can't do it alone. I need your help. John mustn't die at home. It'll raise suspicions. First Jacob, then John. That's why it's the easiest thing to do. It's the easiest, cleanest option. If he gets hit by a car, killed, that's a pretty common situation. 1,000 people get hit by cars every day, especially nowadays. It's so easy to come up with explanations. The guy's in grief. He's buried his father. He's worried. He didn't see the car coming at him. That's my mission, I take it. You're right, but it's not your car. Buy some wreck and then get rid of it. You think about it. We can finally be together like we've always dreamed of. Fly away from here, settle somewhere on the islands, have our own house and enough money to live a good life. We could open a little bar by the sea. Not for the money, just to have something to do. And a party atmosphere any day. Wouldn't that be nice? David turned off the tape, everyone staring at him in silence. How was it? He asked. Does my story pull my confession? And at the same time, how much do you get for organizing an attempted murder? You've always been a jerk and a slug. Kathy wrinkled her nose. Don't you realize that with that stupid tape, you're not only drowning me, but yourself as well? David looked her straight in the eye. I realize a lot more than you think, he said calmly. And you see, I like prison better. Than what? Than an untimely death, which you would certainly and very soon arrange for me. Am I not right? Kathy didn't answer. The police will be here soon. John spoke up. Kathy wrapped her robe tightly around herself and turned away to the window. You a shole. You'll rot in jail. David shrugged his shoulders and sat down in his chair. Nothing against it, he said. Sometimes prison is much safer than freedom. And a clean confession should help me and help the investigation. John promised to put in a good word for me. Maybe I'll get off on probation. I ain't got no bodies on me or nothing. Kathy sighed heavily and sobbed, and her happy world came crashing down in an instant. She was betrayed just as she had betrayed everyone. Everything came back to her in a boomerang, and she deserved it as much as anyone.